For the most part, we've primarily talked about managing a Linux system from the shell prompt. Be aware, however, that you can also implement a powerful graphical user interface on your Linux system, or the GUI, the GUI. Here's the issue. Most system administrators, as well as network administrators, are comfortable with the Linux command line interface. We're not intimidated by long shell commands that use a whole bunch of different options, but I can promise you that your end users will not be thrilled at all with that command line interface, and frankly, most of them will hate it and will probably refuse to use it. Instead, most end users will be much more comfortable if we provide them with a graphical user interface. With a graphical user interface in place, your users can then interact with the Linux kernel using a mouse instead of just the keyboard, which is a much more preferable option. The X Windows system provides the base for the graphical user interface on Linux. It allows you to run applications within Windows. It also allows you to move windows around on the screen, as well as click on items with your mouse. Basically, you can use the X Windows system to implement a graphical user interface on Linux that works basically in the same way as Microsoft Windows. In fact, you'll probably find most of the same components that you're already familiar with on Windows within the Linux graphical user interface. Here's a search field. Here's a list of desktops that you can select. Here's a list of icons you can use to start applications. Here's some options you can use to adjust the volume or power the system off. One of the great things about the Linux GUI is the fact that it's very modular. It's composed of several different pieces that work together to create the graphical user interface. And because the GUI is modular, you can actually mix and match different components together to customize the way it looks and the way it works. This provides a great deal of flexibility, which you don't get with other operating systems. So the Linux GUI is composed of the components you see here. The first is the X server. The X server is the heart of the Linux GUI. The X server is responsible for drawing windows graphically on the display screen. It's also responsible for managing your mouse and your keyboard. Now, we call it a server because it's actually capable of displaying its output not just on the local monitor, but potentially even on a different system somewhere else on the network that's also running the X server software. And just as a hint, you can use the display environment variable on your system to control where the X server is going to send its output. The display environment variable contains the IP address of the system where the X server is going to send its display output. Now, be aware that over the years, multiple X server software packages have been implemented on Linux system. The one that we're going to be working with is X.org X11. X.org is currently the most commonly implemented X server system, and I think you'll find that it is the default X server used by most modern Linux distributions. However, until about 2004, the Xfree86 package was the default version of the X server that was used by most Linux distributions. Now, it works and functions in pretty much the same way as X.org. In fact, the development of X.org was based on Xfree86. However, they ran into some licensing issues with Xfree86. And because of that, the Linux community migrated from Xfree86 to X.org. The next component we need to look at is the window manager. Now, the X server creates the windows within the GUI environment, but the window manager's job is to customize how those windows look and how they behave. There's actually a wide variety of different window managers that you can use on Linux. Each one offers a different look and feel for the GUI environment. Some of the more popular ones are shown here, such as Enlightenment. This is the one that's used with GNOME, which is probably one of the most popular desktop environments currently used on Windows. There's some older ones called FVWM, KWin, which is used by the KDE desktop environment, Sawfish, TWM, and WN Maker. Now you might be asking, wow, which one of these is best? Well, the answer is none, really. It just depends on what you like. Now, some window managers are very elegant, and they're complex, and they're full-featured. This would be window managers like Enlightenment, KWin, and even Sawfish. Other window managers, on the other hand, are very, very minimal in nature, such as FVWM, which stands for Feeble Virtual Window Manager, and its name describes the way it works, as well as the Tab Window Manager and the Window Maker Window Manager. Now, depending upon which types of users are going to be using the system, I would kind of stay away from the minimalist window managers. They're not very fancy. Instead, I would go with the more advanced window managers like Enlightenment or Kwin because they provide a more full-featured window manager on your system. And this allows you to create a look and feel that's more reminiscent of Microsoft Windows, which makes it easier for users who probably learned how to use a computer on Microsoft Windows to begin using Linux. Next, we need to look at the desktop. Now, the desktop environment leverages the look and feel created by the window manager and then adds a series of tools and utilities to make the graphical user interface truly useful. Basically, it ties all of your GUI components together into one cohesive environment. Now, the desktop environment is optional, but it's also highly recommended. There are some Linux distributions, such as those designed for security and such, that won't have much of a desktop environment installed, but those designed for end users will have a very nice desktop environment configured. Now, just as with your X server and with your window managers, the desktop environment you use on your Linux system is modular, which means you can try out different environments and find out which one you really like. The two most common desktop environments currently used with Linux systems include KDE and GNOME. Now, KDE is shown here. It's an excellent desktop environment. It provides all the functionality that you're used to with Microsoft Windows. For example, we have the little start button down here that we can click. A menu pops up, and then we can select which application we want to run from the list displayed. In fact, this is the default environment that's used by many distributions. You could also use GNOME if you want to. GNOME is excellent. In fact, I like it better than KDE. Don't tell anybody that or I might get in trouble. GNOME is the default environment that's used on distributions like Red Hat, OpenSUSE, and many others. Now, the GNOME interface is slightly different. Instead of having a start button down here, you instead just type what it is that you want to run in the search box, and a list of matching results will appear here, and you can say, I want that one. Or you can use one of these shortcut icons over here to immediately just launch like Firefox or LibreOffice or whatever it is you want to run. So these three components, the X server software, the window manager, and the desktop environment all work hand in hand to create your overall GUI environment on a Linux system. And you can mix and match between all three different components to customize the system to match your particular tastes and your preferences. So that's it for this lesson. In this lesson, we discussed the Linux graphical user interface. We first talked about the role of the X server, we talked about the role of the window manager, and then we talked about the role of the desktop environment.